You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today is a very special episode of Law and Disorder. This episode is the third and final piece of a special look at the 20 years after the Beltway sniper. This three-part series is brought to you by Off-Duty Management. Off-Duty Management is dedicated to supporting and protecting law enforcement agencies, their officers, and community vendors by offering a fully customizable, centrally administered, no-cost solution that manages all aspects of off-duty programs and keeps agencies in full control, mitigating their risk and liability. You can learn more about them at offdutymanagement.com. To conclude our look back at the sniper investigation, let's hear from Anna Muckenfuss, our Manager of Programs and Education Initiatives and host of Law and Disorder. Today she brings us 20 years after the Beltway sniper, Part 3, Terror on the Beltway, looking back to the investigation.
The evening hours of October 2nd, 2002 were seemingly normal in the D.C. suburb of Wheaton, Maryland. Commuters were heading back to their sleepy neighborhoods, away from the bustle of the nation's capital. Some stopped to run errands on their way home, and Shoppers Food Warehouse was a popular destination for grocery shopping. Shoppers were bustling in and out. Nothing in the air would have led anyone to anticipate anything out of the ordinary. But suddenly, there was a loud boom, and a man who had been walking toward the entrance of the store was now crumpled on the ground. He's bleeding profusely from what appears to be a single bullet wound. The victim was 55-year-old James D. Martin, a program analyst for a federal climate agency, stopping by the store on his way home from work. No one saw an attacker. There was no struggle, no sign of an attempted robbery. It was as if the bullet came out of nowhere, and from his fatal wound, it was apparent that the bullet that struck Martin had been fired from a great distance. It was almost as if the gun were fired by a sniper. But that doesn't happen in the parking lot of a grocery store, especially in a suburb of the nation's capital. Investigators and civilians alike found themselves very puzzled by the incident. Little did they know, this event was only the beginning of 22 days of terror that would grip the city of Washington, D.C. and its surrounding suburbs, and it would leave a lasting legacy on the psyche of our nation's capital. This is Law and Disorder. My name is Anna Muckenfuss, and today we're going to continue Precinct 444's coverage of the Beltway sniper case, which hits its 20th anniversary this year. This episode accompanies two bonus episodes that we've recorded, which feature an oral history interview with Chief Charles Moose of the Montgomery County Police Department about his experience investigating the Beltway sniper case. But we also have an interview with Chief Tom Manger. He's currently the chief of Washington Metropolitan Police Department here in D.C., but he was the chief of police in Fairfax County, Virginia during these attacks. So he's got some really good stories to share. Additionally, we at the National Law Enforcement Museum have just published an online exhibit titled The Beltway Snipers on our website. The exhibit features a look into our vast collection of artifacts from the Beltway sniper investigation, and I sincerely encourage you to check it out. The link for the exhibit is going to be in the description of this episode. So, now let's get back into the case. So the DMV did not receive a very long reprieve after the shocking death of James D. Martin in the Shoppers Food Warehouse parking lot. By 10 a.m. on October 3rd, 4 additional shootings had occurred, and the victims all suffered from fatal wounds that were eerily similar to Mr. Martin's from the night before. The first victim of that morning was 39-year-old landscaper James Sonny Buchanan, who was struck just after 7:40 a.m. while mowing the lawn of an automotive dealership in Rockville, Maryland. About a half an hour later, a second victim, 54-year-old part-time taxi driver Prem Kumar Valekar, was killed in Aspen Hill while pumping gasoline into his taxi at a mobile station off of Aspen Road. 20 minutes later, at 8:37 a.m., Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old babysitter and housekeeper, was shot at the Leisure World Shopping Center in Norbeck. At the time of her murder, she had been seated on a bench at a bus stop, just reading a book. The final victim of the morning was 25-year-old Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, who was killed while vacuuming her Plymouth Grand Voyager at a Shell station at the intersection of Connecticut and Knowles Avenues in Kensington, Maryland. All of these victims died of a single gunshot wound fired from a significant distance. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of attempted robbery or some other physical altercation with their assailant. In each case, the shooters struck and then vanished. The bullets just appeared to have struck them out of nowhere. And other than just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, participating in regular mundane activities, there was really nothing to personally connect these victims to one another. The only thing they truly had in common was the sudden and shocking ways in which they died. And that was enough of a pattern for investigators to suspect that these attacks were being perpetrated by the same person, or persons. At this point, the crimes have only been committed in Montgomery County, Maryland, a jurisdiction that makes up the northernmost suburbs of Washington, D.C. The initial investigation is spearheaded by Chief Charles Moose of the Montgomery County Police Department. Recognizing the serial nature of the crimes, Chief Moose specifically requests the help of federal law enforcement specializing in serial killers and serial crimes in general. So the FBI was assisting in the investigation early on. But this changes when the crimes expand into additional jurisdictions. At 9:20 p.m., 72-year-old retired carpenter Pascal Charlot is fatally shot while crossing Georgia Avenue Northwest at Kalmaya Road Northwest in Washington, D.C. On October 4th, the first fatality occurs in one of D.C.'s Virginia suburbs, when 43-year-old Caroline Sewell is shot as she loads her purchases from a Michael's craft store into her minivan at the Spotsylvania Mall in Fairfax County. Fear spreads quickly through the region. Schools are put on lockdown, and students are being kept indoors for the entire duration of the school day. Eliminating outdoor recess and physical education classes is just an added safety precaution. Parents were taking their children out of school early, many refusing to put them on the school bus or allowing them to walk to and from school. And commuters feared waiting outside at bus stops, while citizens tread lightly as they ran their errands, fearing that they could be the next of the sniper's victims. Law enforcement is feeling like, despite the growing number of victims, they have very few leads to follow. By October 4th, each of the killings are connected forensically by ballistic evidence. Rifling marks on the fatal bullets match, which means that they were fired from the same gun. Law enforcement initially believes this would have to be a .223 rifle. But there's no telling who is doing the firing, where the shooter is firing from, or how the shooter is moving between scenes so quickly, or even when they're likely to strike again. It's nearly 3 days before the shooters will claim their next victim. Local and federal law enforcement are working together at this point to find the sniper and put an end to these shootings. The FBI works to digitally map the growing number of locations where shootings have occurred, and a telephone tip line is immediately set up and receives thousands of tips from concerned members of the public. One of the most important types of tips that law enforcement is looking for initially pertains to the car that the snipers are using to travel between crime scenes. Understandably, eyewitness accounts of the attacks were mostly confused and spotty. Eyewitness accounts in general typically misremember a few details, but when the witness is in a state of panic, the details become even less reliable. In the initial days, a witness described seeing a white box truck driven by 2 men speeding away from the Shoppers World parking lot after that first shooting on October 2nd, which drove investigators to search far and wide for a white box truck, really to no avail. After the Spotsylvania shooting, investigators were tipped off about a gray sedan, but that was another false lead. After the shooting in D.C., however, witnesses began to describe seeing a dark blue Chevy Caprice rather than the white box truck. Investigators began canvassing the area, talking to people, collecting surveillance tapes, and watching for white box trucks, not really looking for that Chevy Caprice for a while yet. The tip about the white box truck was prematurely leaked to the press, whose coverage of the case was rapidly growing as the number of victims rose. This kind of stalled investigation efforts, but so did roadways that were cordoned off with officers inspecting all drivers. This caused the already congested traffic of the D.C. area to sit at a standstill for hours at a time. Meanwhile, our list of victims is growing far longer. On October 7th, the youngest of the sniper's victims, 13-year-old Iran Brown, was shot in the chest and critically wounded as he arrived at Benjamin Tasker Middle School. Luckily, his aunt, Tanya Brown, was a nurse, and she had been the one to drop him off at school that morning. She was able to rush him to a hospital emergency room almost immediately after the shooting happened. Despite sustaining serious injuries, including damage to several major organs, Brown survived the attack, and he would ultimately testify at the trial of John Allen Muhammad, who we'll introduce to you later. At the scene, investigators found a shell casing and a death tarot card. On the face of the card, which is already jarring with its imagery of a skeleton in armor mounted on a black horse and waving a black flag, the words "Call me God" are cryptically written across the top. On the back of the card, an additional message read, "For Mr. Police, code Call me God, do not release to the press." Despite law enforcement's initial intention to keep this development from leaking to the press, information about the tarot card was published by WUSA-TV, a Washington CBS affiliate, and the Washington Post just a day later, and it added to the frenzy of public panic. On October 9th, at 8:18 p.m., another victim is claimed. 53-year-old civil engineer Dean Harold Myers was killed at a Sunoco gas station while fueling up his vehicle right outside of Manassas, Virginia. 2 days later, another gas station patron, 53-year-old businessman Kenneth Bridges, was shot dead while pumping fuel at an Exxon station outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, off of Interstate 95. Because of these two incidents, gas stations in the area began hanging tarps to conceal their customers while they're filling their tanks. On October 14th at 9:15 p.m., 47-year-old Linda Franklin, an FBI intelligence agent who was a resident of Arlington County, Virginia, was shot in a covered parking lot at a Home Depot in Fairfax County. Her death brought the investigation even closer to home for many FBI investigators on this case. The biggest break in the case came on October 17th, 2 weeks after the first shooting, when a caller who claimed to be the sniper phoned into the tip line, claiming responsibility for the murder of 2 women during a robbery of a liquor store in Montgomery, Alabama, a month earlier. Investigators would later learn that only 1 woman had actually been killed, but from this phone call, the investigation began to really accelerate. This was the first tip that could actually lead investigators not only to the car, but also to identifying the sniper, or snipers, themselves. As they began to uncover information about the reported murder in Montgomery, Alabama, and confirmed that an incident like it had indeed occurred, investigators were able to examine a fingerprint and ballistics evidence from the case. As the investigation is underway, additional victims are claimed. On October 19th at 8 p.m., 37-year-old Jeffrey Hopper was shot in the parking lot near a Ponderosa Steakhouse at State Road 54 in Ashland, Virginia, about 90 miles south of Washington, near Interstate 95. His wife, Stephanie, called out to a passerby who was able to phone an ambulance, and Hopper actually survived his injuries. While searching the scene, authorities discovered a 4-page letter from the assailant in the woods that demanded $10 million and made a threat to children. Investigators in the Richmond area, still following leads about the white box truck, did end up arresting 2 men, one of whom owned a white van, outside of a gas station on October 21st. On October 22nd, Montgomery County ride-on bus driver Conrad Johnson was shot just before 6 a.m., standing on the steps of his bus at the 14,100 block of Grand Prix Road in Aspen Hill, Maryland. He was assisting one of his elderly passengers in boarding the bus when he was struck. Luckily, the investigation would take a serious turn in merely hours, and Johnson would be the last of the sniper's victims. While the ATF worked to match ballistic evidence from the Montgomery, Alabama scene to evidence from the shootings in D.C., the FBI tried to identify the fingerprint. At one of the shootings, a dropped magazine had been recovered, and fingerprints had been lifted. The fingerprint from the Montgomery, Alabama scene was compared to the fingerprints that were found on that magazine, and they were a match. Finally, investigators had a suspect, Lee Boyd Malvo. He had been previously arrested in Washington state and was already in the FBI's AFIS system. And while reading that initial arrest report on Malvo, investigators were provided with another very important lead, the name of a potential accomplice by the name of John Allen Muhammad. An FBI agent from Tacoma, Washington, had recognized the name from a tip that was called into the office on the case in which Malvo had actually been arrested. Now that investigators had a suspect, ATF got to work, diving deeper into the ballistics in the case and both Muhammad and Malvo's criminal histories. It was discovered that John Allen Muhammad had a Bushmaster .223 rifle in his possession, which for him was a federal violation. He had been served a restraining order to stay away from his ex-wife, and the stipulations in the restraining order maintained that it was illegal for him to own such a firearm. This enabled the FBI to charge him with federal weapons violations and obtain a warrant for his arrest. And with Malvo clearly connected, the FBI and ATF jointly obtained a federal material witness warrant for him as well. On October 22nd, 20 days after that initial shooting, the FBI searched Muhammad in their criminal records database, and they found a dark blue Chevy Caprice with New Jersey tags registered to his name. Information about the suspects and the Chevy Caprice were quickly released to the media, and tips flew in. It took no more than 24 hours for the sniper's car to be spotted just before midnight on October 23rd. A few hours later, at 3:15 a.m. on October 24th, a team of Maryland State Police, Montgomery County SWAT officers, and special agents from the FBI's hostage rescue team located the sniper's vehicle and the two suspects, who were found sleeping in the parked car at a rest stop near Myersville, Maryland, off of I-70. The two suspects were arrested with no incident, and when investigators searched the Chevy Caprice, they found a trove of revealing and shocking evidence. The car had essentially served as a rolling sniper's nest. A nearly undetectable hole had been cut in the trunk of the car near the corner of the license plate so that the shooter did not even have to leave the car to fire the weapon and hit his victims. Other evidence included the Bushmaster .223 rifle that had been used in each attack, as well as a scope and tripod that would steady the shots and help them take aim. A back seat that had the sheet metal removed between the passenger compartment and the trunk allowed the shooter to enter the trunk from inside the car. And then a Chevy Caprice owner's manual was found with writing impressions on the cover, which matched one of the demand notes. There was also a digital voice recorder that both Malvo and Muhammad had used to make extortion demands, as well as a stolen laptop that had belonged to one of their victims and contained maps of the shooting sites, including getaway routes for some of the crime scenes. Additional maps and walkie-talkies were also found within the car. The arrest of the snipers effectively ended their reign of terror in the DMV, and citizens finally felt a sigh of relief after 22 days of worrying about whether or not their daily commute would be their last. Due to the number of jurisdictions in which the snipers' attacks were committed, both Malvo and Muhammad had multiple trials, the first of which took place in Virginia. On November 17, 2003, Muhammad was found guilty by a jury in Virginia on all 4 of the charges for which he was on trial. These included 2 counts of capital murder, one for the shooting of Dean H. Myers, and a second as a charge under the Virginia anti-terrorism statute. Others included homicide committed with the intent to terrorize the government or the public at large, and conspiracy to commit murder, as well as the illegal use of a firearm. The jury unanimously recommended that Muhammad be sentenced to death, and that sentence was upheld by a Virginia judge on March 4, 2004. On March 10th of 2009, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection and pronounced dead at 9:11 p.m. He declined to share final words and also to have his last meal published by the press. His execution was witnessed by 27 people, including the families of his victims. Prior to the execution in Virginia, however, John Allen Muhammad did have an additional trial in May 2006. It was in Montgomery County, Maryland, where a majority of the shootings took place. At this trial, his accomplice, and in some of the crimes, the triggerman, Lee Boyd Malvo, took the stand. He confessed to a more detailed version of their plans. After extensive counseling, Malvo also admitted that a statement he'd made shortly after his arrest, when he admitted to being the triggerman to every shooting, had been a lie. Malvo claimed that he had said this in order to protect Muhammad from the death penalty. Malvo had been a minor at the time of the crimes and knew it was more difficult to achieve the death penalty for a minor in court. Malvo expressed his regret for making the false admission and stated, "I'm not proud of myself. I'm just trying to make amends." In his 2 days of testimony, Malvo's detailed account of the shootings gave the public a view of the breadth of carnage the pair had initially planned to enact. A good amount of Malvo's testimony outlined Muhammad's complete multi-phase plan, which gladly remained unfinished. He'd planned a reign of terror in 3 phases that would take place in both the D.C. and Baltimore metropolitan areas. Phase 1 included the meticulous planning, mapping, and practicing in their locations around the D.C. area. The pair wanted to be able to quickly move and leave the area on a predetermined path. After each shooting, they wanted to be able to move inconspicuously to the next location. According to Malvo, Muhammad's goal was to kill 6 white people a day for 30 days during Phase 1. Malvo explained that Phase 1 did not go as planned, however, and this was due to constraints like heavy traffic and the lack of a clear shot or a clear getaway at some of the different locations. Phase 2 was to take the pair up to Baltimore, and Malvo described that the phase was close to being implemented but was never actually carried out. Disturbingly, Muhammad had intended that Phase 2 begin with the murder of a pregnant woman by shooting her in the stomach, followed by the targeting and killing of a Baltimore police officer. The pair then planned to place several improvised explosive devices at that officer's funeral, which they hoped would kill a large number of officers. Finally, Phase 3 was to take place very shortly after, if not during, Phase 2. It was essentially a large extortion plot to con the United States government out of several $1 million in order to finance a larger plan that would take Muhammad and Malvo up to Canada, where they would recruit other effectively orphaned boys like Malvo and train them to use weapons and stealth before sending them out to commit shootings across the country. Malvo's testimony not only gave the public a far clearer look into the madness of John Allen Muhammad, but it also helped to secure that the elder of the 2 snipers would receive the most severe punishment for his crimes. Despite his testimony against John Allen Muhammad, Lee Boyd Malvo was also tried for his crimes committed during their 22-day spree. He was initially arrested under federal charges, but those charges were dropped, and instead he was moved to jail in Fairfax County, Virginia, where he was charged with 2 capital crimes and the unlawful use of a firearm in the murder of FBI analyst Linda Franklin. Malvo did confess that he intended to kill all of the victims he targeted, and he was put on trial. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity to all of the charges against him on the grounds that he was under Muhammad's complete control as the shootings were taking place. He was eventually found guilty by a jury and sentenced to life without parole, though his sentence would slightly change due to the Supreme Court ruling of Miller v. Alabama in 2017. It was ruled that his initial sentence of life without parole, served to him while he was a minor, was now unconstitutional. However, Malvo does remain in Red Onion State Prison as part of the Virginia Department of Corrections, and in August of this year, he was denied his first request for parole. Thank you for listening to this installment of Law and Disorder. We hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the Beltway sniper case, which is a huge part of our collection here at the National Law Enforcement Museum. The Bushmaster 223 rifle is actually on display in the exhibit at this time, at least at the time that we're publishing this episode. It's in our Take the Case exhibit, and if you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C., come visit us and see it for yourself. That's all for us on Law and Disorder this week. Hope to see you again at the precinct very soon.
This concludes our special look back at the Beltway sniper investigation 20 years later. Thank you again to our sponsor for this special series, Off Duty Management. Be sure to look them up online at offdutymanagement.com. Thanks to Anna Muckenfoos for writing, researching, and sharing today's program, and to Christopher Mitchell, our manager of digital content and strategy, for producing. And many thanks to you for listening to this episode of Law and Disorder, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. If you didn't catch our other episodes looking back at the Beltway Sniper, be sure to check out parts 1 and 2. We hope you enjoyed this episode and will join us again for another story of Law and Disorder. This has been a Precinct 444 production brought to you from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 E Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.